All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Teves, Mrs. Selma Wall, for dedicating all of her Sherman Drushos this month with immense gratitude for the refuos from our Kadosh Baruch Hu and in the merit of our refuah shlema for all of those in need, the schus of our brave soldiers, and the schus of the return of all of our hostages. Our week of learning sponsors, Chazan Mark Childs of Santa Barbara, California, in appreciation for the Daf Yomi, and in the schus of refuah shlema for Binyamin Yankel ben Beila. And of course, as a shir, we dedicate Meseches Baba Kama Le'ilui Nishmas Master Sergeant Yomi Chol Charush Hashem Yikom Damo, in the schus of our learning, may HaKadosh Baruch Hu provide an aliyah for his neshama and a nechama for his family. Well, so with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Mem Tes 49, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Mem Ches 48b, and we're picking up 13 lines up from the bottom. So we got so close to finishing the sugya yesterday, but in Meretz Hashem we will complete it today with some really interesting halacha lamaisa as well. So remember again, we left off actually with the contradiction between brisos. So we'll say after this entire exciting journey, we've now kind of circled back to the core and fundamental machlokes in the Mishnah, which is a machlokes between the Rabbanon and Rebbe, namely, what does permission to enter mean assumption of responsibility as well? That's our fundamental machlokes. The Rabbanon say, when Shimon gives Ruvain the right to go ahead and enter into his chatzar, what Shimon is doing is not only giving Ruvain the right of entry, but Shimon is assuming all responsibility to protect Ruvain from any type of damage. Rebbe says, absolutely not. Permission to enter means just that, permission to enter without assumption of responsibility and liability. The only time you assume responsibility for the other is if you explicitly articulate that. So says the Gemara. So let's pick up. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Tavra, Misha Shanazu Lo Shanazu. Show the contradiction in Bryce. Rabbi Elazar says you write two different opinions. Rava Amar Kula Rabbanon. Rava says no, the entire Bryce says Rabbanon. Aidi dinasav reisha shamru. I'm sorry, the time Mishnah. Aidi dinasav reisha shamru tana seifa shamru. And again, essentially, there's Mishnaic symmetry. Since the beginning of the Mishnah, ultimately used lashon of shamru, of guarding. Therefore, again, the Seifa uses the same lashon, Tana Seifa, Va'ani Eshmerenera. Papa says, Kula Rebbe, the entire Mishnah reflects the view of Rebbe. V'sovelak Rabbi Tarfon. And Rebbe, in fact, holds like Rabbi Tarfon. What does Rabbi Tarfon say? The Amar, Karen B'chatzar HaNizek Nezek Shalim Mishalim. This is the famous position of Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon holds that, interestingly enough, that as much as normally Karen Tam pays Chatzi Nezek, Karen Tam, which occurs in the domain of the damaged party, you pay Nezek Shalim Hilchach. Therefore, Amrulei Shamru. If ultimately, again, Reuben says to Shimon, watch your stuff, so lamakni leimakom b'chatzar. That means Shimon is not conveying any use of his chatzar over to Reuben. V'havilei keren b'chatzar hanizak, and therefore, again, any damage becomes keren in the property of the damaged party. Keren b'chatzar hanizak b'shalim nezek shalim, and ultimately, again, the halach is according to Rabbi Tarfon that you pay complete damages for keren b'chatzar hanizak. To which the Gemara says, Lo Amar Le Shamru, but if Shimon doesn't say to Ruvain, watch your stuff, therefore again, that means that Shimon is assuming responsibility. Aknuye Akni Le Makom B'Chatzar, Shimon is conveying ownership, or not ownership, but usage of part of the chatzar over to Ruvain. V'havile chatzar shutzfin, and therefore again it becomes like a chatzar that belongs to partners. The karen b'chatzar shutzfin inu mishalim v'chatzi nezek, and any karen that is done in jointly owned property that only pays chatzi nezek. So the point over here, both is you could interpret the Mishnah as reflecting both opinions. So bottom line, halacha l'maisa, who do we paskin like? Because as I mentioned in yesterday's shir, this is a big issue. Ruvain gives Shimon gives Ruvain permission to enter into his chatzar with his shar. So Ruvain brings his shar into Shimon's chatzar, ultimately again with Shimon's permission. The shar does damage, or the shar is damaged, right? One of the two. Ultimately, again, who is liable? who is liable? Do we paskin like the Rabbanon, that permission to enter means that Shimon is assuming responsibility, or do we paskin like Rebbe, permission to enter does not mean assumption of responsibility? So Rabbi say, here it is, the long-awaited, much anticipated halacha l'maisa. So the Rambam paskins in Hilchos Niskei Mammon, Perek Gimel halacha. It's really halachas Yud Gimel and Yud Dalid. But listen to this. He brings down all the cases. Hakadar shehichnis. Actually, let me actually illustrate in the next case. Fine. Remember again, Reuben brings his pots into the domain of Shimon. Okay, now what happens? So again, the Rambam goes through the cases. Shelo b'shus, if Reuven just brought them in and he did not have permission to bring them in, ushavartan behemto shabal habayis pater. So Reuven doesn't have permission to bring in his pots. Shimon's animal, Shimon's shar, tramples the pots and breaks them. What's the halacha? So the truth is, that's an easy one. That's an easy one. Obviously, again, Shimon's not liable. Reuven's trespassing. What happens again if Shimon's animal trips over the utensil and falls and breaks its leg? Right? Then what's the halacha? Reuven's chayiv. That's the easy case. Why is that the easy case? Why? That's shelo b'rshus, right? Any time that you're bringing your property into someone else's property without their permission, Reuven's bringing his pots into Shimon's property without Shimon's permission, right? And the pots are broken, or the pots cause damage, right? Obviously, if the pots are broken, Shimon's not chayav for that. What are you doing in my property? And if Shimon's animal is damaged on Reuven's pots, then of course Reuven's going to be liable, because again, what are you doing there? That's the easy case. Now watch this. What happens if Shimon gave Reuven rishus? Shimon says, sure, you could bring your stuff into my property. So the Rambam paskins pater. Now, pater means what? Pater means that halacha l'maisa, if Shimon's animal were to be damaged on Reuven's property, let's say again Shimon's shar were to trip over Reuven's pot, then obviously in that case Reuven would be pater. Right? Why is Reuven pater? Because he has permission to go ahead and bring in the utensils. Now both say, now the shaila is, that's fine, but still what's the outlying case? What happens if Reuven's animal does damage if Shimon's animal does damage to Reuven's pots when he's brought them in with permission? Is there liability? So it's interesting. The Rambam says this as Vim kibel alav balabayis lishmar sakaderos balabayis chayiv. If Shimon explicitly stated that he is willing to accept responsibility to safeguard the utensils, and then something happens to the utensils, then what? Then Shimon will be chayiv. Or Abos, I stated otherwise, the Rambam paskins like Rebbe. This is riveting, fascinating. Namely what? When Shimon gives permission to Reuven to bring stuff into his property, into his chutzner, what is that? What is that? That's permission, but enter at your own risk. Enter at your own risk. I take no responsibility for what happens to your stuff when you come into my chutzner. If Shimon were to say, come into my chutzner, and ultimately again, I promise you that your stuff is going to be safe, then Shimon has assumed responsibility. But stam permission to enter does not mean assumption of responsibility. So ultimately, again, the Rambam paskins like Rebbe. So a really fascinating idea. So remember again, going back to our case. Yes, remember again how we illustrated this. This is very lemaisa, right? Someone goes ahead and invites someone over to my house for lunch, right? And of course, I have my dog Zoe. I'm going to call her Zoe just for illustration's sake. Zoe, right? So, right, Zoe's very friendly, always very excited. She's wonderful with hachnasas archim and mamish. Like she has such an avas Yisrael that she jumps on everyone and literally again, slobbers on Reuven's suit. Now Reuven has a dry cleaning bill. Technically speaking, halacha l'maisa, I, the balabas, don't have a responsibility to pay for that dry cleaning. Now again, you want to ask Lifnim Mishra Sadin, what's the right thing to do? The right thing to do is whenever you cause someone damage or someone is damaged on your property, ultimately again there may be a din of taking care of them. But Lamaisa, the Rambam paskins like Rebbe, which is really quite interesting. So halacha Lamaisa, permission to enter means just that, permission to enter, and does not mean assumption of responsibility. Incredible. Okay, let's go to the Mishnah. Shar shehaya miskavin lechavera v'hikasi isha. This is an interesting case. If you have a shar that you could tell was ready to do damage, right? In other words, the shar was clearly bent on doing damage. So it was going to, let's say again, it's my shar. Let's call it Ruvain's shar. And Ruvain's shar was charging towards Shimon to go ahead and gore Shimon. And what happened? And instead the shar ends up injuring a woman, and she miscarries. So what's the halacha? Pater midmei valados. Ultimately, the owner of the shar has to pay for the damages to the woman, but there are no what we call demei valados. So we'll say, now remember again, we mentioned this before already, but this halacha l'maisa is talking about the concept of the Torah talking about when two people fight, right? And let's say again, in the course, Reuven and Shimon are fighting with each other. In the course of fighting with each other, Reuven accidentally injures a pregnant woman, and she miscarries as a result of the injury. So there's a halacha that says that the aggressor, the Reuven, has to go ahead and pay to the husband of the woman the value of the pregnancy. Again, we're going to discuss that in greater depth. The point that the Mishnah is making is that is only a din in people, not a din in shvarim. So therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, if Reuven's shar was was charging at Shimon, and a pregnant woman, Rahman al-Islam, got in the way, and she was injured and she miscarried, there's no demei velados. There's no payment for the value of the offspring, for the value of the fetus, value of the pregnancy, paid to the husband of the injured woman, because it's a shar. That's what the Mishnah teaches me. That doesn't apply to a shar. So the Gemara says, "Va'adam shayim miskavin lechavera v'hikasei isha v'yatzul adel." B'sham d'mei v'lados. But if Reuven and Shimon are fighting, and Reuven means to hit Shimon, and he ends up accidentally hitting a pregnant woman, and she miscarries, in that case, Reuven will be liable ultimately again for the value of the pregnancy. Keitza m'shayim d'mei v'lados. So we'll say, how do you assess the value of a pregnancy? So Gemara says, very simple. Shamanes ha'isha kama hi yafa ad shelo yalda, v'kama hi yafa mishi yalda. It's very simple. We look at the value of a pregnant woman, right? Now, the Mishnah is presupposing that the value of a pregnant woman is higher than the value of a non-pregnant woman, right? And now, again, the value of the pregnant woman is increased from the perspective of the Mishnah for two purposes. Number one, because a pregnant woman will be physically larger, so the Gemara ascribes some level of heightened value to just the increased mass. Plus, there's the value of the offspring, right? Again, she's going to go ahead and have a child. So therefore, again, we look at that value. Plus, right, and we compare that to the value of a woman who's not pregnant. And obviously, whenever these people have values of people, we're obviously talking about, again, if they were sold as a servant. So a person purchasing a female servant who is pregnant, obviously again represents right an increased workforce, because ultimately again the offspring is also going to be a servant. So we look at, again, value of a pregnant woman versus the value of a woman who's not pregnant. And what's that, right? So, and that difference, so to speak, is the value of the fetus. Rabbi Shmuel says, Imkain, both the top of Memtes 49a, Imkain, Misha Ishe Oledes Misha Bachas. So the Gemara says, Ella Shamanes, so literally again, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel's statement is not immediately clear. He says, if that's the case, when a woman gives birth, she's worth more money. So we're not clear exactly what it is that he's saying. We'll see in the Gemara. Ella Shamanes Havlados Kamehein Yofin V'nosin Labal. Rabbi Shimon seems to say is that halacha l'maisa, we go ahead and we somehow evaluate the value of the offspring of the fetus independent of the mother. We'll see exactly how we do that. And remember, I'm going to say this payment is given to the husband. Now, why is it given to the husband? So I'll say this is Xeris HaKasav. The Torah says we give Dmei Velados, the value of the offspring, we give it to the husband. So what happens if there's no husband? Let's say the husband died. So then what's the halacha? No sin the Yarshav. Ultimately, again, we give this payment to the heirs of the husband. Let's say again, the woman in question was a maidservant who became emancipated, or a convert. Now, we're going to see what these cases mean is these are people maybe in a case where the husband died, there may be no heirs. No heirs. So in a case like this where there's no husband and there's no heirs to the husband, then what's the halacha? Ultimately, again, the perpetrator is pater from paying this amount. Okay, we'll discuss all these cases in greater depth. So we'll say, let's analyze. Says the Gemara. We'll say, remember again, first case of the Mishnah was, Reuven has an ox. The ox was charging towards Shimon. But unfortunately, again, it ends up injuring a pregnant woman instead, causes her to miscarry. So therefore, the Mishnah says that halacha l'maisa, the Mishnah says that ultimately Reuven, the owner of the ox, is pater from Dmei Velados. Again, I just want to point out, but also remember again, just to point out over here, and the Gemara is going to explicitly say this in just a moment, there's two buckets of damages when you damage a pregnant woman, right? There's typical damages, whatever typical damages are of a person, right? We have boshes, pagam, sheves, ripuy, shai, all these different things is damages. In addition to all of those basic damages, there's also the concept of dmei velados, of the value of the lost pregnancy. Damages normally go to the victim herself. It happens to me, dmei velados, that value of the pregnancy, Torah gives that payment to the husband. So again, the Mishnah over here is not talking about damages. The Mishnah over here is talking about dmei velados. So therefore, again, the Mishnah says Reuven's ox is charging towards Shimon's ox, or Shimon himself, right? Pregnant woman gets in the way. She gets injured, miscarries. Reuven, the owner of the ox, doesn't have to pay dmei velados, the value of the miscarried pregnancy. So the Gemara says, Taima de miskavin lechavero. So it sounds like the reason why Reuven doesn't have to pay is because his ox was really aiming for Shimon. So the Gemara says, Ha miskavin leisha mishalim dmei velados. But from the Mishnah, it sounds like that if Reuven's ox was purposely charging towards the pregnant woman and injured her and she miscarried, that she would pay, that he would pay, that Reuven would pay. So let me leima tevetiyuv to the Ravad Barabba. So this would seem to refute the position of Ravad Barabba. What does Ravad Barabba say? Damar Ravad Barabba, shvarim shenis kavnu liisha pturim midmei velados. That ultimately Ravad Barabba says that even if a shar goes ahead and intentionally injures a pregnant woman, you still don't pay dmei velados. Says the Gemara, Amar l'cha Ravad Barabba hu adin tafil neskavnu liisha nami pturim midmei velados. So Ravad Barabba was saying in reality, even if the shor purposely targeted the pregnant woman, at the end of the day, the owner of the shor is exempt from paying for the value of the lost pregnancy. And so why did it go ahead and mention it? Why did it frame the case as a shor that was ready to go, or another shor, but the pregnant woman got in the way? So the Gemara says, Adam shayim miskavin lechavero, the hachi ksiv kra, katani reisha nami shar shayim miskavin lechavero. So essentially, the Gemara says the Mishnah just wanted to preserve symmetry, textual symmetry. So it stated the case is the same way. Really, the second case in the Mishnah, which is the paradigmatic biblical case, right? Reuven is fighting with Shimon. And then what happens? He means to go ahead and hit Shimon. Instead, he hits a pregnant woman. She miscarries. That's the biblically paradigmatic case. So the Mishnah wants to align the Reisha in the same way. A shar means to gore another shar, but instead it gores a pregnant woman. But I will say, but the truth is, it's important to understand, a shar, the owner of a shar, is never responsible for the value of the miscarriage, what we call dmei velados. That's just the way the halacha is that the shor will be responsible for damages, but not dmei velados. The concept of paying for the value of the lost pregnancy, that is only a halacha in interpersonal damage, is not halacha that applies in the case of a shor that damages. It's not a din in shor amaz. Okay, so we'll say that's our first fact for today. Well, not our first fact. First fact in this Mishnah. Amra Papa, Shoshin Agachas Shifcha. It's an interesting case. Shar, if an ox, right, Reuven's ox gores a shifcha, and I will say shifcha is a shifcha kinanis, a non-Jewish maidservant. The Yatsu Yilada, and she miscarries. Mishalim Dmei Velados. In that case, the owner of the shor will pay the value of the miscarriage. My taima, Chamarta Ma'abarta Ba'alma. Because ultimately, again, the shifcha kinanis, she's like a pregnant donkey. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean? So also, we've seen this before, that in halacha, the way that an eved kinani is looked at is as property. is as property. So Rabbi says, so because of that, so therefore again, so chamarta ma'abarta ba'alma hu da'azik, amrikra, so Rabbi say, again, where do we get this from? Shvu lachem poi machamar im hadoma lechamar. By the Akedah, Avram Avinu says to Eliezer, or says to Yishmael, Shvu lechem poi machamar, stay here with the chamar. Who's the chamar? The chamar is a reference ultimately again to Eliezer, who was an Eved Kenani, im hadoma lechamar, with he who resembles a donkey. Nebo says, so again, remember, not meant to be a disparaging statement, meant to be a technical halachic statement. That ultimately, again, Eved Kenani has a din of property. So therefore, technically speaking, although we just got finished saying that halacha l'maisa, if a shar gores a pregnant woman, there's damages, but there's no demei valados. You don't pay the value of the miscarriage because that's only a din in interpersonal damage. The exception to this rule will be a shar who damages a pregnant shifcha. In that case, it actually has the status of one animal, so to speak, damaging another animal, another piece of property, and therefore you would pay demei valados. Okay, keitzam misham demei valados. So we'll say, so now first, end of the first wide line. So remember again, we'll say, how do you assess the value ultimately again of the pregnancy? So the Mishnah seemed to indicate that we look at the value of a pregnant woman versus the value of a woman who's not pregnant, and the difference between those amounts, that's the value of the pregnancy. So the Gemara says as follows, Case Moshaim Demei Valados. So Demei Valados, Shevach Valados Mi Bayile. So everyone say, so the truth is the Gemara says it's not really just simply the value of the fetus. Remember again, Abosai, as I mentioned before, pregnancy brings a general appreciation, right? An appreciation in the value of the woman in her totality. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Demei valados shebach valadosu diktani shamanes haisha v'yesh bechlal shumazu demei valados umasha isha niras mishubachas uba'alas evarim mipnei ha'ubar v'demei karim. So the Gemara says something interesting. Demei valados makes it sound like all we're talking about is the value of the fetus itself. But remember, as mentioned before, I'll say, remember, it sounds strange like to talk like this, but when a woman becomes pregnant, she's larger, right? As a result of being larger, ultimately, again, there's more value. Again, we're looking at this just as value, right? So the demei valados is not just the value of the fetus, right? But lamaisa, again, there's also an increased value because the mass of the woman is greater. So ultimately, again, the Gemara is just saying your term of demei valados seems to be limiting. Shouldn't just mean demei valados; it should be shevach valados, the increase in total value. So the Gemara says, this is what it means to say, you're right, demei valados, v'shevach valados. So the Gemara says, you're right, what I mean to say is like this. How do we assess, ultimately again, the value of the fetus, that's the demei valados, and shevach valados, and the additional appreciation in the value of a woman? Shaman asaisha kama hiyafa ad shelo yalda. We look at the value of a woman as, right, her value when she's pregnant, before she's given birth. The kama hiyafa mishi yalda. And ultimately, again, her value after she would give birth. So the Gemara says, we take into account both of these, so to speak, these buckets of appreciation. Both the value of the fetus itself, as well as the increase of value because now the woman herself is larger. Says Gemara, so I'll say, so now remember again, Rabbi Shmuel made this strange and cryptic statement in the Mishnah. He says, if that's the case when a woman gives birth, she's worth more. So the Gemara says, my ka'amar, what is Rabbi Shmuel saying? Amar Rabba, what does it mean to say? V'chein isha mishabachas kodem sheteled, yosim mishala'ach sheteled. So Shmuel says, I don't understand. You guys are assuming that a pregnant woman has a higher value than a non-pregnant woman. Right? Shmuel says that's not true. V'alo isha mishabachas la'achar sheteled, yoser mikodem sheteled. Rabbi Shmuel says it's actually interesting. Rabbi Shmuel posits. He says that halacha l'maisa, a pregnant woman is worth less. Now, I both say, now why is a pregnant woman worth less? So it's interesting. So I would have thought the reason for it is because remember, I both say, all of these values are looked at through the lens of what? Servitude. So right, I would have thought that. So Rabbi Shmuel raised an interesting point. He says a pregnant woman is in constant sakana. I know, as I will say, a pregnant woman, remember, pregnancy in general, a pregnant woman is considered, in halacha, a pregnant woman is considered to be a chola sheyesh ba sakana. She's considered to be a woman who is ill, who is in mortal danger. So Rabbi Shmuel says, that's not an appreciation of value. A woman who's not pregnant, I will say again, it's just a regular person. A regular person, by definition, essentially what Rabbi Shmuel is saying is, it's going to sound strange, but like a pregnant woman is a woman with a health issue. Is one with a health issue. So because she's with a health issue, why is everybody assuming that she's worth more? I think just the opposite. A pregnant woman is worth less, right, than ultimately, again, a non-pregnant woman. So the Gemara says, "V'halo isha mishabachas achar shetelit yosem rekodesh shetelit ela shamenes havlados v'nosin leblad." So therefore, again, I will say, take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over "V'halo isha mishabachas bedam la'achar shetelit dimitchila dameh pchusin." In reality, Rabbi Shmuel says when a woman is pregnant, her value is less. Limaker, for if she's going to be sold, so to speak. Shemisukenes hi lamos b'tzar leida. There is a sakana that chas v'shalom she could die in childbirth. And by the way, it's not just die in childbirth; it's a whole variety of chas v'shalom different complications that could occur because of pregnancy. V'hachi mashma masnisin imkein dikach shamike dika'amrot. So what's this interesting? So whereas the Tanakama says, remember again, the Mishnah is trying to figure out, here's what we know about say, right? Ruvain is getting in a fight with Shimon, and Ruvain goes ahead and instead injures a pregnant woman. She miscarries. So what's the halacha? So now Ruvain is obligated to pay the value of the lost pregnancy to Shimon. So how do you evaluate the lost pregnancy? So the Tanakama says, it's simple. A pregnant woman is worth X, right? And a non-pregnant woman is worth X minus Y. So that difference is the amount you pay. Rabbi Shmuel argues on the very premise. He says, Tanakama, you're assuming a pregnant woman is worth more than a non-pregnant woman. So Rabbi Shmuel says that is not true. A pregnant woman is actually worth less than a pregnant woman. So therefore, how do you assess damages? We look just simply at the value of the uber, a fetus. A fetus has a value, right? I guess like a future value. Like somebody would buy, right? If a person was pregnant and let's say a servant was pregnant, or now, right, there'd be a value to that fetus. We look at the value of the fetus, and ultimately, again, that's the amount you have to pay to the husband. Okay, says the Gemara. That supports this. Isha mishabachas kodem shetel yosem mishachas shtele. So what the Brisa says, Shmuel says, is a woman worth more when she's pregnant than when she's not pregnant? Follow Isha mishabachas na'achar sheteled yosem kodem sheteled. A non-pregnant woman is worth more than a pregnant woman. Ella shamenes havlados v'nosin lebal. So both say. So therefore, again, what we do is we look at the value of the fetus. We look at the value of the fetus. And ultimately, again, we pay that to the husband. So both say so here's what's interesting. Everyone is agreeing that when you injure a pregnant woman and she miscarries, you have to pay the value of the lost pregnancy to the husband. The shaila is, how do you value a lost pregnancy? Tanakama, we look at the difference between a pregnant woman and an unpregnant woman, presupposing that a pregnant woman is worth more. And therefore, again, that difference is what you pay. Rabbi Shmuel, no, because a pregnant woman is worth less than a pregnant woman. So therefore, we just simply assess the value of the fetus itself. Incredible. Rav says, Haki Katani. This is what it means to say. So I'll say, Rav has a different interpretation. Rav says, Rabbi Shmuel saying is like this. That at the end of the day, is the appreciation of a pregnant woman only in the pregnancy and only for her husband? What about the general appreciation that a pregnant woman has? We just spoke about this before, just in the fact that there's more of her, right? So because there's more of her, ultimately, again, there's a more general appreciation as well, and doesn't that belong to her? So the Gemara said, is the appreciation of a pregnant woman only for her husband? Doesn't she share in that appreciation as well? So both say this is interesting. So Rabbi has a different approach. Rabbi says there's two different pockets of appreciation. There's the value of the fetus, right? And the value of the fetus, that goes to the husband. But then I will say also there's the appreciation that she has physically, independent of the fetus. In other words, there's more of her. So because there's more of her, ultimately, again, there's appreciation. So that appreciation is split between the husband and the wife. That supports when a woman is pregnant and she appreciates, so to speak, is that appreciation only to her husband, but ultimately, again, she doesn't get anything. Rather, Rabbi say, what do? We evaluate ultimately again the damage by itself. Suppose this is what we were speaking about before. So remember again, there's damages. And ultimately there's tsar, vishamin es havlad, also knows in the Baal. So we'll say, so just to be clear, right, there's a whole bunch of buckets of damages over here, right? When you injure another person, so again, there's all the regular buckets of damages, tsar, pain and suffering, nezek, damages, ripoy, doctor's bills, boshas, humiliation, ripoy, sheves, lost wages, all those things. In addition, if a person injured a pregnant woman and she miscarried, now there's this other bucket of payment called dmei velados. Now I will say, now in addition to that, if she was pregnant and now she's no longer pregnant because she miscarried, there's also the loss of appreciation that she had just as a pregnant woman, independent of the fetus. So the Gemara says, so the dmei velados, the value of the fetus, that goes to the husband. V'shevach velados cholkin. But ultimately, again, the appreciation, just due to the fact that she was pregnant, that gets split. To which the Gemara says, Kasha Rabbi Shmuel Silber. So isn't there not an inherent contradiction? Although Kasha, it's not a contradiction. Kan b'mevakeres, kan b'shin mevakeres. So both is interesting. It could be the following: that even in the Shita Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, there's a difference between a first pregnancy and subsequent pregnancies. When she's pregnant for the first time, we do not know how she's going to weather this. So because of that, there's an acute drop in her value when she's pregnant, because you don't know, Rahman also understand that just historically, right, the percentages of women who died during childbirth. You know that there's a halacha that we have a minhag. I shouldn't say a minhag. It's a minhag that when a woman gives birth to a child, she adds on another Shabbos candle. Beautiful minhag. I will say, what's the source of that minhag? The source of that minhag, I will say, is that traditionally, when a woman gave birth, she missed lighting candles the first Shabbos of her life, of after giving birth. Right? Why? Because she was bedbound. Right? Childbirth was a much more, it's a traumatic event now, but Baruch Hashem, today you could do it in a hospital, today you could do it with medication, today you could do it with epidurals, right? Today there's a whole bunch of other science, but it was very common for a woman after she had given birth to be in bed for a prolonged amount of time, which often meant that she missed the first Shabbos after her child's birth from Hadlakas Neros. What's the halacha if a woman misses lighting candles? What's the halacha? There's a knas, there's a penalty, so that she shouldn't forget again that she lights an additional candle. So again, these concepts merged, and ultimately again it became that a woman lights, the minhag is that a woman lights an additional candle for every child that's born. But I will say, but it just gives you a window into what childbirth, it doesn't give us a window into what childbirth was like, but historically what it does is it gives us a window into just the even enhanced traumatic experience that it once was. So therefore, again, it could be that Rabbi Shmuel talks about this idea that the value of a pregnant woman is diminished. That's when she's pregnant the first time, and we don't know how she's going to handle the pregnancy, and we don't know what's going to happen with childbirth. As opposed to once already she's undergone the process, then halacha l'maisa, it could be that it's a different circumstance. Okay. So Rabbanan Amri Shevach V'Lodos Nami L'Baal My Taima. So we'll say now, interestingly enough, the Rabbanan themselves, they don't make a distinction between the value of the fetus versus the general appreciation of a pregnant woman. They hold that entire amount goes to the husband. So the Gemara says, what's their logic? Since the pasuk talks about that she miscarried, why does the pasuk need to say that she was pregnant? So the Gemara says, to teach us that the husband not only gets the value of the miscarried fetus, but he also gets he's entitled to the general appreciation from the pregnancy. Rabbi Shmuel hara my darsh. Rabbi Shmuel, what do you do with that hara? So the Gemara says, "Mi bari le'lichi desanya." Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov Omer, the olam eno chayiv ad sheyakena kineged beis heirayos. He means it for the following drasha, that in general, both say if a man injures a pregnant woman, If a man injures a pregnant woman, he's only chayiv if he delivered a blow, near the area of the womb. So the Gemara says, Amra Papa lo tema kineged beis haramam. She doesn't have to be literally opposite the womb, the stomach. Ela kol heichad the salik bei shichma livlad. So I'll say what it means is you're only chayiv for an injury where it's normal that ultimately, again, such an injury would impact the baby, would impact the fetus. That's when you're chayiv ultimately for causing the woman to miscarry. La fuke yad v'regel delo. So we'll say, for example, let's say Reuven injures a pregnant woman. He kicks her. He kicks her very hard in the ankle, right, and breaks her ankle. And as a result, she miscarries. Not that she falls, right, and it falls on herself, but she miscarries. So we'll say that would be the kind of injury where there would not be liability for the lost pregnancy. Why? Because a broken ankle should really have nothing to do with a miscarriage. In order to be chayiv ultimately, again, for causing the woman to miscarry, for damages, it has to be the type of injury where it makes sense that there's a correlation between this type of injury and the miscarriage. Okay, interesting halacha. So Mara will say, so again, I just want to point out halacha, how do we paskin? So we paskin like the Tanakama, like the Rabbanan, not like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. So first of all, we'll say in halacha, we accept the premise that a pregnant woman has a higher value than a non-pregnant woman. So that's number one. So therefore, again, I will say in a case where a man injured a pregnant woman and caused her to miscarry, so in addition to all the damages that he has to pay her, he also has to pay the value of the lost pregnancy. And on a simple level, how do we evaluate lost pregnancy? So we take a simple pshat with it, which is value of a pregnant woman, right, versus value of a non-pregnant woman. The difference between those two is considered to be the value of the fetus, the value of the pregnancy, and that is the amount that ultimately, again, the perpetrator is obligated to pay to the husband. Beautiful. Says the Gemara, Nishtach Haisa Shivcha v'nishtachara o giores pater. So most of the Mishnah said, halacha l'maisa, if the pregnant woman was an emancipated slave woman, right? Or ultimately, again, a convert. So I will say, so now remember again, then the Mishnah says that the perpetrator is pater from paying the value of the lost pregnancy. So what does this mean? So Amar Rabba, lo shon ela shechava ba b'chaye hager, umeis hager. This will say, now obviously we're talking about over here as ourselves. Let's just illustrate this in the case of a giores, right? Rachel is a convert. Rachel is a convert. So now what happens? Rachel is married to Ruvain, the convert. Two gerim. What happens now? So now Rachel becomes pregnant. Now after Rachel became pregnant, Ruvain died. I'm sorry, actually let's stop. So now Rachel's fine. So now Rabbi says like this. So now what happens? Shimon injures Rachel, causes her to miscarry. So now obviously what's the halacha? Right? So now Shimon has to pay the value of the lost pregnancy to who? To Ruvain, the husband. Now what happens? Before ultimately again, Shimon has a chance to pay, Meis Hager, Ruvain, the ger husband dies. So what's the halacha? Kevan the chavav b'chay hager, zacha b'hu ger. The chevan the Meis Hager, zacha b'hu min hager. So I will say, so in this case now, by the time Shimon goes ahead and gets ready to pay, what happened? Right? So Ruvain's gone. Reuven's God. Now we're dealing with a case over here where, again, he's a ger, he has no offspring, and as a ger, there are no other relatives either. So this would be a case where ultimately, again, because there's no husband in the picture, and ultimately, again, there's no heirs to the husband, therefore what? Shimon the perpetrator is exempt from paying the amount. Aval, chava bala achar misas ager, zachila ihi bigavayhu, o mechayiv l'shalom ilalidideh. However, if ultimately, again, Ruvain, the husband, died, right? Rachel became pregnant, Ruvain died, and then Shimon injured Rachel, caused her to miscarry. In that case, there was no husband in the picture at the time of the damage. Rachel herself would acquire the rights to the payment. That's Rabbah. Rav Chisda says, Maridichi, who is the author of this ruling? Atu vlados tzrarininu. Ultimately, again, our offspring just considered to be tzrari, like literally, again, like packages. V'zachia bahu, and anyone could acquire it. Ella isei labal zachali rachmana. Rather, both say ultimately, Rav Chisda, here's the way this works. if there is a husband in the picture, the husband gets the fine, the amount. So Zakir Rachmana Leise Labal, if there is no husband in the picture, ultimately again, there's no payment. So Rav Chisda, so we'll say, so Rabba wants to make a distinction ultimately again between was the ger husband alive at the time of the damage or not. Rav Chisda says no. It's very simple. Is there a husband alive at the time of payment or not? If there's a husband alive at the time of payment, you give him the money. There is no husband alive at the time of the payment, then what? No payment. No payment. So let's analyze a bit more. Says the Gemara, good. Meisvei, hikas ha'isha v'yatziladeha. Ultimately, Reuven injures a woman, right, and ultimately causes her to miscarry. So, or I should say, Shimon injures Rachel, causes her to miscarry. What's the halacha? No say nezek v'tzar li'isha. So again, damages you give to Rachel herself, to the woman herself. Udmei v'lados labal, and the value of the lost offspring that goes to the husband, to Reuven. Ein habal. What happens if there's no Reuven? Right, Reuven died. He's not in the picture. No sin liyarshav. Ultimately, again, you give to Reuven's heirs. Right. Ein. No sin liyarshav. Ein habal. No sin liyarshav. Ein haisha. What happens if the woman's not in the picture? In other words, Rachel, let's say, died. So now again, you pay damages. No sin liyarshav. You ultimately give to her heirs. Haisa shivcha v'neshtachara ogiyores. What happens if the woman in question is an emancipated maidservant or a giores? Zacha. Ultimately, in these cases, the mazik, the damager, doesn't have to pay anything. Simar says, what? I don't understand. Why would this be any different than our Mishnah, which we set up ultimately, again, it's talking about a case where Shimon injured Rachel while her convert husband Reuven was still alive, and therefore ultimately again, and then he died. So to over here, this should be a case where ultimately again Shimon injured Rachel at a time where her convert husband was alive, and then he died. So the Gemara says the other possibility is the achar misa sager. The other possibility is it could be ultimately after her convert husband died. Amud Bezer will say the Tani. Zachsa. And ultimately, again, we should write that Allah says she's entitled to it. So we'll say, so say that this whole thing is a machlokes tanoim. Here we go. Basi Soshani says Lager, Finis Abra Mimenu. So we'll say, if a regular Jewish woman, Rachel is a regular Jewish woman, she marries a ger. Right, Reuben's a ger. She becomes pregnant. And now Shimon comes and injures her and causes her to miscarry while her ger husband is still alive. No sein lo demei velados. So again, I will say, what's the halacha? Shimon has to pay Reuben the value of the lost pregnancy. Li'achar misas hager. What happens ultimately again if, right, Shimon injured Rachel. Rachel was pregnant, but Reuben had already passed away. So now Shimon injures Rachel. She loses the pregnancy. What's the halacha? So the one is the achar misas hager tani chada chayiv, the tani chada pater. One opinion says that Shimon is going to be chayiv. One opinion that says that Shimon is going to be pater. My love tanoininu. So ultimately again, so what do you see from here, Abosai? What you see from here is that ultimately again, when there is no husband in the picture because he died, there is a machlokes tanaim. There's machlokes tanaim about what you do regarding payment. The Rabba vaday tanohi. According to Rabba, there's definitely a machlokes tanaim. El Rav Chisda milei matanai. But according to Rav Chisda, is this a machlokes tanaim or not? Lokashya harabanan harb shegam liel. Both say could very well be that it's reflecting two different opinions. One is the opinion of the Rabbanan, and ultimately again, one is the opinion of Shimon Liel. So if that's the case, why does it have to be a case after the husband died? Afilu mechayim nami is la palga. Ultimately, again, if that's going to be the case, I will say then halacha l'maisa, right? Even when the ger is alive, ultimately, again, she should be entitled to half. Mechayim islay palga. When she's alive, ultimately, again, she gets half. The achar misa kule. Then she should be entitled to the whole thing if he's no longer alive. The other possibility is havahar b'shegam liel. Both reflect the Rabbi Shmuel Silber. Kan b'shevach v'lados, kan b'dmei v'lados. So I'll say, so remember again, when it comes to Rabbi Shmuel Silber, remember, as opposed to the Rabbanan Rabbosai, who only have one bucket of payment called Dmei Velados, Rabbi Shmuel Silber himself had two different buckets of payments, which is there's Dmei Velados, which is the value of the fetus, and what we call Shevach Velados, which is general pregnancy appreciation. The distinction between the two is that Dmei Velados ultimately again goes to the husband. Shevach Velados, the woman gets to share in that as well. Amri, so the Gemara says, Mishavach Velados, Lishmei Dmei Velados. Ultimately, again, from Shevach Velados, we should be able to learn the halachos of Dmei Velados. And from Shmuel's position, we can learn out the Rabbanon. Amri lo. It said no. Shevach v'lodos the shaycha yada begavayu zachya behu bekulu. So we'll say ultimately again when it comes to shevach v'lodos, when ultimately again that includes her personal appreciation as well. So ultimately again she has a chelik in that. So maybe in the absence of the husband, she acquires everything. Dmei v'lados de lo shaycha yada begavayhu lo zachya behu klal. But I will say halacha l'may said dmei v'lados, which she never has an entitlement to. Perhaps again, therefore, even if he's not in the picture, she does not get that at all. So I will say. So bottom line, how do we paskin? So I will say. So this is actually very interesting. It's actually very interesting. So the way the halacha will work is as follows: if there is a husband in the picture at the time that the damage occurred, then halacha l'maisa, the damager is obligated to go ahead and pay that husband if he's still alive, or ultimately again his heirs if he's no longer alive. If technically speaking there was no husband in the picture at the time the damage occurred, then technically speaking the damager is exempt from Dmei Velados. Again, it's just a technicality. That's because again that penalty that payment is only assignable to a husband. So again, if the husband's in the picture at the time of the damage, it's paid to him or to his offspring. Again, if he dies, but if there's no husband in the picture, then ultimately again no payment assigned. I will say you also already know that anytime the Gemara launches into these discussions, ultimately again about shevach v'lados, dmei v'lados, we don't really accept that distinction because remember again that distinction only works according to who? Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, and we don't pass like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, we pass like the Rabbanon. Okay, says let's go back to this. So now that the Gemara brought up some other interesting converts, so now the Gemara brought up the convert case, right? So obviously, why do we bring up the convert case? Because in the convert case, I will say, if let's say again, Ruvain's married to Rachel, they're both converts. Both converts. Doesn't really matter that she's a convert in this case, right? Now Shimon, right? Shimon comes along, injures Rachel, and ultimately again she miscarries. So now if Reuven is alive, Shimon has to go ahead and pay Reuven. What happens if Reuven's not alive? So now if Reuven has children, then fine, you'll pay the kids. What happens if Reuven doesn't have children? So both say, so remember again, the unique status of a ger. What's the unique status of a ger? See, when it comes to a Jew from birth, there's one thing you could count on, which is he's related to someone, right? It may be distant, but you could always find a relative. With a ger, if a ger has biological children, those are his relatives. But if he does not have biological children, then technically speaking, there is no one to whom he is related. In which case, you could have a situation where therefore the damager wouldn't end up having to pay the Dmei Velados. Okay, so based on that, the Gemara says, "Boy mine Rav Yeva Sava mi Rav Nachman." Supposed to listen to this. Rav Yeva Sava asked the following question of Rav Nachman. Here we go. Amachzik b'shtarosav shalger mahu. So Rabbi say, what about the following case? Listen to this. We'll call him Ruvain, right? Ruvain is a ger. Now Ruvain had lent money to Shimon, and he has a loan document. And in that loan document, ultimately again, so now Ruvain has a claim or a lien against Shimon's property. So now what happens? Ruvain dies. Ruvain has no children. So Rabbi say, what's the halacha now with the property of a ger who dies with no children? What's the halacha? Hefker, which means anyone who wants could take them and seize them. So now Ruvain dies, Ruvain's a ger, Ruvain dies, leaves behind no children. And now what happens? Shimon comes along and Shimon takes possession of those documents. That's a machzik b'shos of shalger mahu. Kevan de machzik b'shtar adaita da'arahu de machzik u'ba'ara lo halachzik. So again, Shimon comes along and says, "This is great. I'm going to take these shtaros. The shtar has a lien against land, right? So now I own the land. Now, of course, no, you don't. Right? No, you don't. So his entire intention is to go ahead and seize the document as a way of becoming entitled to the land. But of course, that's not the way land ownership works. So the Gemara says, "Ushtara nami lokana," and we say ultimately again, the same way you didn't acquire the land, you also didn't acquire the piece of paper itself, right? Delav daite ashtara, because ultimately again, obviously, Shimon's intention is not to go ahead and acquire the piece of paper. Oh Dilma, daite nami ashtara, or maybe not. Maybe when Shimon comes along, he says, "Listen, as much as I'd love to acquire the land that's specified in this document, if I can't acquire the land, at least I'm going to acquire the piece of paper," right? Because a piece of paper, a piece of parchment also has value. So the Gemara says, I will say, and I will see, what good is a piece of paper? What are you going to use it as, a bottle stopper? Yeah, actually yes. That's not hers. The paper itself still has an independent value. Again, even if the shtar is not really value, it doesn't really have a value because the shtar doesn't tell me to do anything, but the piece of paper itself could still act as a bottle stopper, so at least he'll acquire the piece of paper as a bottle stopper. Amarabba, Mashkono Sheisab Yadges. So we'll say another very interesting case here. Watch this. So we'll say, so again, we're just bringing this up now since we spoke about cases of a ger who died ultimately. Again, we're just bringing this up again. Another case also, which let's at least, so again, Salah Chametz in the previous case, Ruvain the ger dies, doesn't leave behind any children. Shimon comes along, sees a loan document. In the loan document, ultimately, again, there's lien against property. So Shimon says, "This is great, I'll take on the lien of property." Sorry, I'm using names repeatedly. Shimon comes along, "It's great, I'll take on the lien of property." Obviously, picking up the shtar if someone else doesn't give you a lien on property. But what it does do is, it gives him a piece of paper. So you're now the proud new owner of a piece of parchment. What are you going to do with it? Whatever your heart pleases, right? But you do acquire the piece of parchment itself. Incredible. But so what about the next case? Mashkono shel ger biyad Yisrael. What about the following situation, Moshe? So now let's say again, we'll call him Ruvain. Ruvain went ahead and lent money to Shimon. Shimon is a ger. Shimon is a convert. Shimon gave Ruvain collateral, right? So now Ruvain has in his hand collateral from a ger. What happens now? Shimon dies. So now ultimately, again, Ruvain has the collateral of a ger in his hand. Umei sager. Now watch this. Levi hears that Shimon the ger died, and remember again, Shimon the ger has no heirs. So Levi says, Levi runs into Ruvain's house, grabs the collateral, because the property ultimately again of a ger who dies is hefker. And I will say, we'll stop over here with this case. This is a really good case. Sorry, again, a long daf today. Again, we'll stop over here for today. We'll say tremendous. We'll pick up with this last case. Shkoyach. All right,